Right.
Hey, everybody we have France and Maryland and Pennsylvania and Michigan, two from France, or maybe, no, you just misspelled it before. The Berkshires, which I bet are beautiful right now. And while we wait for Facebook, Dr. Krugman, hello. And you know the Berkshires yourself, don't you?
Indeed. Not to give too much away, but we spend, um, Robin and I spend a fair part of each summer there when we can. And yeah, lots of stuff. My parents get retired there. Anyway, great area.
So if I recall correctly, and it's entirely likely I don't, the Berkshires became a summer resort for people from Boston in like the late 19th century when you could buy up old farmhouses for like nothing because the people who had lived out there went out west. Is that right?
Yeah, land was very cheap. Basically most people left either for city jobs or places where the soil wasn't full of rocks. And and then they built, there's a fair number. I mean, Edith Wharton's house is there. There are the great mansions, which mostly now are museums, but it's lovely. And of course it's shifted now. At this point, if you ask what does the area do for a living, it basically provides services to rich New Yorkers with second homes. But all right, that's not a bad thing either.
And part of the old New England tradition, actually, is I'm sitting here on the coast of Maine, we do a lot of that as well, and did a lot of that all along. Those rocks do make it difficult to pull a living out of the soil.
Yeah.
But that's a nice segue to what we were going to talk about today.
Yeah.
You've been writing so much interesting stuff about AI and about crypto and wondering about the rise of this financial elite. Like, what do you want to talk
Yeah.
about today?
Yeah, I wanted to talk to a genuine historian as opposed to a
We'll see.
econ nerd who reads a bit of history on the side. That's me, obviously. So I've been partly inspired by Elon Musk, the first trillionaire, but just generally this incredible rise of extreme wealth and extreme political influence, and a lot of harking back to the Gilded Age. I still find people saying, "Are we going to have a second Gilded Age?" And my God, we actually passed Gilded Age levels of wealth concentration about 25 years ago, but now we are way beyond that. But still, my question is actually a funny one. And I don't know who else I could ask better than yourself. How is it that who aren't exactly a democracy, but something democratic-ish and constitutional, how is it that America survived the era of the robber barons when it seems to be in so much trouble now? And I think that's kind of a starting point for a whole discussion about what has changed. What at some level, what's wrong with us now?
I think there are a lot of things that are different now than were then, but there are some similarities. One of the things that happens is that if you remember the Republican Party, which forms in the 1860s, the late 1850s, early 1860s, and really starts to put its policies in place during the Civil War during the 1860s, that becomes really tightly associated with the United States of America, with the government. So what you do is you get a number of the original founders of the Republican Party who end up, many of them, becoming industrialists or supporting the policies of the robber barons. But then you have the next generation, and it's coming to age in the 1880s. And the next generation comes of age, and this is going to be people like Bob La Follette in Wisconsin and Theodore Roosevelt in New York and Henry Cabot Lodge in Massachusetts and Albert Beveridge in Indiana.
Yeah.
And those are all people who can't be a Democrat because they see that as the party of the South. They see that as the party of rebellion. They're gonna stay in the Republican Party. Even when a lot of people in 1884 jump ship and become mugwumps and Republicans vote for Democrats, they stay in the Republican Party, but they are staunchly committed to the principles for which the Republicans fought during the Civil War, for which the North fought during the Civil War. So as they watch the country becoming more and more corrupt, they start to rise and to take power based on the idea that they're going to return the country to that earlier system. And they managed to make common cause with the populists, the alliance members, and the Democrats who have been standing against the robber barons all along, and to take over the system in the late 1890s. And of course, they're dramatically helped by I hate to talk about assassinations for many reasons, but by the assassination of William McKinley in 1901, which puts Teddy Roosevelt into the White House, a source of power for that reformist coalition that might not otherwise have happened. But you saw that groundswell beginning in 1884, and really this change in the Republican Party toward reform, the same way the Democrats were. And one of the things that really jumps out to me in this moment is that the Republican Party has just rolled over and played dead. It's just gone for Trumpism. And that was a surprise to me all along.
Yeah, I mean, so there, I hadn't really understood that there was a significant reformist wing within the Gilded Age Republican Party, which obviously nothing like that now. And I guess it probably is important that if you want, maybe there's some kind of meta equivalence between the civil rights movement and the Civil War, but our civil rights movement did not involve the Republican Party. It was all coming from the other side, and so in some sense we had all kind of I don't know, a legacy of the 19th century greatest generation that helped to temper the oligarchic influence. Is that the right way to read it?
Well, yes, except the modern day civil rights movement pulled heavily from Republicans.
This is true.
Remember, it was largely bipartisan. That whole coalition, the bipartisan coalition, really shatters in 65, and then going into 1965 and into 1968 and forward with Nixon and the embrace by the Republicans of those Dixiecrats, those people who wanted segregation. But I actually think there's something more interesting in the difference between the past and the present. And this is something that speaks, I think, to your work and what's going on in finance and in the economy right now. Because, of course, we saw extremes of wealth in the 1850s and the 1890s, again in the 1920s, and certainly in the present. But one of the things that is different now than was then is that after World War II, you get a much more powerful international financial and economic system. And one of the things that does, I think, is it takes American, very wealthy capitalists in America. Well, I hate the word capitalist, but people have a lot of money in America. Yeah. It takes them and it embeds them in an international system. So in the late 19th century, there's a real panic over how big the trusts are and how powerful the trusts are. Like literally, senators would introduce themselves by saying, I'm the senator for the Sugar Trust, for example, which was the biggest trust in the 19th century. But what happens is there's a panic over that. And by the early 20th century, you have a move to try and pull big money out of politics. And it starts really being articulated by the populists with anti-Semitism. But by the early in 1908, 1909, you start to get a much more general, hey, wait a minute here. We're noticing that not only do we have these big corporations, we also have big money in them, because when people like JP Morgan start to put up the money to consolidate these trusts, they're like, hey, we want a say in that. And so by 1911, 1912, you get one of my favorite congressional committees ever, and that's the Peugeot Committee. And the Peugeot Committee is run by a guy from Louisiana whose last name is Peugeot. He actually doesn't finish the committee because his wife gets sick and he has to go home. But it looks into the relationship between the people's money and how it's being consolidated by bankers and being used then against those people to rig the economic system. And from that, we get the Peugeot report. And from that, we get, which says basically JP Morgan sits on every major industrial combination in the country. And then we get Louis Brandeis writing Other People's Money, and how the bankers use it, which I'm sure you know, talks about how the people are being basically taken to the cleaners by the banks that are rigging the system against them. And from that, we get the direct election of senators, so you no longer represent a trust, and we get the embrace of an income tax amendment. And so you get reform coming out of that. Now, in this moment, And that was a very long segue to say,
Right.
one of the things that worries me is when you look at the really big money that is operating against the American people, because there is big money operating for the American people too, usually where people don't pay attention to it. But, I look at cryptocurrency. I look at AI, and I look at the fact that with the internationalization of our political and economic, or our economic system, these guys don't need to be approved in the United States anymore. They can do whatever they want. At least it looks that way to me. Is that an overstatement?
It's a bit of an overstatement, but let's get there. I just want to say one thing, that when I read, again, amateur history reading, but what strikes me about the uh, early 20th century is how quite sort of mainstream political figures were willing to talk about the political danger of immense wealth in a way that, until it's finally come back, but really just in the past couple of years, you have Woodrow Wilson, and I'm probably not all that sincere, but Woodrow Wilson saying, if there are men big enough to own the government, they will own the government, basically advocating estate taxation, progressive taxation, not simply for the money, but because the political economy of a republic requires that there not be immense fortunes on that scale. And that would have been, that would have, until just the other day, people would have screamed socialism, communism, if any major political figure said that. I think we're starting to get there. So there's a definite openness to that. Now, in terms of your question, okay, there are, it's a little, the situation right now is, I wish it were a pure thing, that there was just the bankers taking my money and your money and using it to prop up these, to make these corrupt businessmen super rich, which is just, it's a piece of it, but less than, I wish it were the whole story. It would be a lot simpler. We seem to have okay, this is going to be very nonlinear, so let me try to do things to say. The concern, I think, with crypto and all of these newfangled, this stuff, is that, aside from the question of why are we doing this, what is the point of it, but that it is attracting a fair amount of unsophisticated money that lots of enthusiasts are buying in. And so, the big story of this week is that Elon Musk is a trillionaire based upon the valuing a money-losing company with a fairly small business as being worth about the same as Microsoft. So, and that is primarily enthusiastic retail investors, although there's a heavy element of institutional misuse of other people's money as well. But what that does, the banks proper, old-fashioned banks with checking accounts and so on, with FDIC in the window, FDIC insured in the window, they are still, in spite of everything, relatively regulated in what they can do. But we have a proliferation of bank-like stuff, shadow banking, we call it, that for most of us looks the same, but in fact, it doesn't have those guarantees and doesn't have the regulation. And now, if the crypto enthusiasts get their way, what is a stable coins? Right? All of these things that we don't want to know about, but a stable coin is a cryptocurrency that supposedly will always be worth $1. And when a company issues a stable coin, so people pay real dollars to acquire the stable coins, and then that money gets used for something, that is a bank. That is, in practical terms, a bank, but it's a bank without any of the regulations, any of the safeguards that proper banks face. And that's a huge risk to the system. The question about, there are a lot of things here to unpack, but it is this wild free-for-all. It is, in some ways, in many ways, we are returning to the free-for-all of 19th century banking, but with additional, what? Yeah. Actually, do you know the origin of the phrase wildcat banking?
No.
Okay.
Is it like the West, where the wildcats are?
Yeah. Basically, but it's not just that it was in the West. It was, originally before the Civil War, before the greenbacks, banknotes were issued by private banks, And a bank would say, here are our notes. We promise to pay you in gold if you arrive at our bank with the notes. But sharp operators would open banks where, to get the notes reclaimed, you had to go to the bank branch. The bank branch was located in the middle of nowhere, where the wildcats roamed, and that was wildcat banking. The other trivia. Sorry, now I'm playing amateur history.
Let me add more to that, because
Yeah.
I actually know that period really well, and I've written on banking in that period. This is one of the things that encouraged family, because you have big families in those days, right, but that encouraged families to send their sons out west, is you would have businessmen, bankers, right, back in Boston and New York, but you needed to be sure that you had secure money out wherever it was you were trying to do business. So you sent out one of the brothers,
oh, wow,
to open, so you could always trust that money. And that's why you end up with a number of families spread out across the North in America after about 1835.
Okay, maybe you can tell me whether one more 19th century banking story is true. Supposedly, in one of the biggest bank in the South in the era of free banking was the Citizens Bank of Louisiana, based in New Orleans, which issued banknotes that were English on one side and French on the other. And their $10 notes were very widely disseminated, and they said on the front 10, on the back 10. And supposedly people would refer to the whole South, where those notes were so widespread, as the land of Dix, Dixieland. And that's supposedly the origin of the whole phrase. Now, I think it's true. Enough people believe it's true that I once said, maybe I'll buy one of those notes. They cost, of course, tens of thousands of dollars because they're collector's items. But anyway, so
I've never heard that. I've always heard it came from the early work of the Stephen Foster, who wrote a lot of the minstrel songs. But I'm going to look into that, because the whole history of banknotes, especially in the South, and how you create here's a segue back to where we are. The way you create a nation is in part by what you put on your banknotes, because people then say, oh yes, I associate with George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, or in the case of Southern banknotes, enslaved Americans looking happy and jolly in the cotton fields. But we are talking in this era, I believe you have said within the last few days that the only use there really is for cryptocurrency is money laundering.
Yeah, there's essentially no, it's speculation, but in terms of actual use cases, sorry, I sound like a business school guy, there's no way, you would not want to do a transaction. It's incredibly cumbersome to use Bitcoin. It's a little bit easier to use a stable coin like Tether, but it's still, what's the point? Banks do a perfectly good job of transferring funds and so on. But if you want your transaction to be invisible, how has Iran been paying for imports during this war? The answer is, well, they've been using cryptocurrency. So that's really the only use for it, is for money laundering, crime. When you get a ransom note because somebody has put malware that is destroying your business, they will demand payment in Bitcoin. So, and it's really nothing beyond that. It's the most amazing thing. And this, Bitcoin is not new. Bitcoin was introduced, I think, in 2009. This is a technology that's older than the iPad, and yet nobody has found a use for it except crime.
So let me ask you on that, and then we can get back to what this looks like in the present era, and the power that, because I'm watching the American people are really unhappy with where things are, but there's a lot of power on the other side that makes that very hard, I think, to crack its power over the American government. But just a couple of days ago, or maybe it was yesterday, I've lost track of time, World Liberty Financial, which is the Trump organization's cryptocurrency venture, they own about 60% of it, and they've also got friends in there with them, have said that they will be becoming, actually, and you explain what this is, they will be able to operate as a bank, not just simply as a cryptocurrency venture. And the marriage of our governmental system and the president to something with his name on it that basically has no use except money laundering, or putting a lot of money in the Trump family's pockets. I think they've made about $2.3 billion in Bitcoin since in cryptocurrency, not Bitcoin, in cryptocurrency, which is, for those of you who don't know the stuff, Bitcoin is the name of a kind of cryptocurrency.
Yeah, it's the original cryptocurrency. And
Kind of like a Kleenex is a tissue is a Kleenex. Anyway, that seems to me to be deeply problematic.
Oh yeah, I mean, at multiple levels. First of all, cryptocurrency itself, the coins, basically the tokens issued by World Liberty Financial have no real use except as well. Now there's a new use, and instead of just being able to make transactions that are hidden from the law, it's a way of putting money directly into the president's pockets. So people will acquire that not because there's any really good use for it, but because of that. And then to the extent it can operate as a bank, it's like a bank that is without any limits. Banks are the reason the final scene of It's a Wonderful Life, right? The bank run. That was a bit of an anachronism, although the movie is supposed to be set in the early 1930s. But when the movie was released, it was post World War II. That couldn't happen because you had the FDIC, and along with the FDIC, you have limits on risk taking by banks. Banks are required to have capital. They're required to have reserves. They're not allowed to make certain kinds of investments. Whatever this turns out being, World Liberty Financial, aside from it being a sort of a more or less open bribery channel, will also be free to take all kinds of risks that banks, for financial stability reasons, are not allowed to take. So this is altogether, it's a corruption of the whole system. You worry a lot about how much, we already saw, right, in 2008, it turned out that the growth of exotic, not that exotic for people in business, but money market funds, but also repo, which was a way to do banking without banks and so on, it turned out had exposed us to a sort of high-tech version of the bank runs of 1931. This would be that, but an order of magnitude worse. So it is very, very frightening. And of course, it's all very much tied into the corruption, which is, but I want to ask you about corruption also, but maybe I should raise that. I mean, one thing that, as I've been doing some sort of statistical stuff, but trying to understand where we are, and I have been harking back to the Gilded Age, and what I find myself wondering is not why is America now so corrupt, but why wasn't it even more corrupt in the Gilded Age than it was? I mean, we had bribery scandal, all kinds of corruption in those days, but Teapot Dome, even adjusted for inflation, was something like $10 million in bribes to the Secretary of the Interior. As you just said, I mean, Trump is about $4 billion richer than he was on January 20th, so of last year. So roughly speaking, Trump has been bribed by a Teapot Dome-sized payout every day since taking office. Why didn't it happen then, and why do people stand for it now?
Well, I don't think there's a single answer. And I think about this a lot because I would like to stop the corruption. And therefore, I spend a lot of time thinking about where the levers of power are to stop it. And the Gilded Age is a great place to work, to look at that. So I think part of it is there really was still a focus on principles, on morals, and on being a good American. And that involved many different things, including working hard to prosper and, trying to live a moral life and not cheating people, and sort of those old small r Republican values. And certainly a lot of people talk about that, and they put it on either side of the coin. Andrew Carnegie talks a lot about that, as well as the people who were standing against him at Homestead, for example. So there is that. But, one of the things that always comes back to me, and of course I'm a political historian, is that what makes the Republican Party, which is what controls the 19th century, the federal government in the 19th century, sit up and take notice, is when the American people are like, we're not going to vote for you anymore. And even though they are in a somewhat limited way trying to manipulate the vote in the North, now they've really clearly manipulated the vote in the South by the end of the 19th century, they are doing the same thing in northern cities, especially to get rid of immigrants, especially immigrant workers, from being able to express their will at the polls. There is still the need to get into office, like you can't impose your will unless your people are in office. And I look at today where it is so possible to manipulate the election results, and I don't mean by stealing them or whatever, but by, these floods of money into the system that, portray the MAGA Republicans as the saviors of the world and their opponents as, engaging in domestic terrorism, for example. And that worries me a lot. It also worries me that at the international level, Andrew Carnegie needed the American system to work. He wanted to be in control of it, but he needed that system to work. I look now at cryptocurrency or at somebody like Elon Musk at the breakdown of national boundaries in a way that, the radical right looks at it and says, okay, people like Curtis Yarvin look at it and say, well, this is just ducky. We're going to create a post-national world that we're going to run. I look at that and I think, I don't want that post-national world that you're going to run. I'm really concerned about maintaining a good system for people in each country, instead of going to this idea of these sort of boundaryless internet-based nationalities, which is what somebody like Yarvin talks about. And it worries me because I don't see as much of a connection between the popular anger and the popular outpouring of a desire to recover American democracy and the late 19th century when, Carnegie had to bow to that to some degree. And that lack of connection strikes me as being partly cultural, like I say, but a lot the rich guys just have so much and they don't really need the nation any longer, it seems to me. What do you think?
I have mixed feelings about it, partly because the late 19th century world was a lot more globalized than we tend to realize. I mean, random stuff. Hjalmar Schacht, who was Hitler's economic architect, was actually named Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, because his father spent a lot of time in Chicago. So there was much more global interchange.
Right. And then with the name of Horace Greeley, he goes on to be a Nazi?
Yeah, it's not clear exactly how much of a Nazi he was as opposed to an amoral technocrat who worked for the Nazis. He probably was a Nazi as well, but the point was there was a lot of interchange of people, of money. Global capital markets were pretty integrated. I mean, you couldn't move money, at a click of a mouse, but you could move it with a telegram. So I think that we may be exaggerating the extent to which globalization is new, but it is true. I mean, Peter Thiel has just, I don't know if he's actually moved to Argentina, but apparently has switched to Argentine citizenship, which is not a great way to beat the accusations of him being a neo-Nazi. It's a, there is, I think that there, I don't know. I mean, I should be the one who says, well, it's all fundamental forces and globalization. But I actually think that the values thing is a really big, that the role of values, that in, the oligarchs of 110 years ago felt at least the need to appear to be respectable and upstanding. And on my Substack the other day, I put up first a photo of John D. Rockefeller and his family, which is a kind of Victorian ideal. Probably, who knows what the reality was, but that was what it's meant to look like. And then Elon Musk and his baby mamas and his many, many, many children. And it just, there's somehow a collapse. There's kind of rawness. Even the hypocrisy is gone now. And yeah, it does help that people can zip off to, I mean, a few months ago, I would have said, well, they're all going to decamp to Dubai, although that doesn't look like such a great idea these days. But, but there was a fair bit of that. There are a fair number of malefactors of great wealth who have basically become a-national now.
Well, that's really interesting, that idea, because I would argue that the American people never lost their decency.
Yeah.
that in communities, and by that I mean everywhere in the United States.
Right.
That's, if you go to New York, it's all just a bunch of communities that live really close together and so on, that those same values still obtain in all of those places, but they seem, especially under Trump, to be divorced from the government. And that idea that somehow the people in the government don't have anything to say to each other is I think a major hallmark of our era. And one of the things that has really interested me since the 1980s is the degree to which, when people look at the American government, they don't see it as us; they see it as something else. And one of the big things about Trump these days that really has jumped out to me is those stupid trousers he's put on the Kennedy Center, which is, him once again finding a way to cheat the system. Okay, I took my name down, but I also am covering up Kennedy's, and
Right.
and you can't make me do anything. And that idea that somehow you're clever if you fight the system, if you fight the government, if you manage to find a workaround so that you can have cryptocurrency that you can launder money with, that idea that people want that in the government and they won't have it in their personal lives strikes me as being one of the lever points that may make a difference in terms of reclaiming democracy, because you look at the extraordinary behavior of certain people in power and you say, you wouldn't put up with this from your kid or your uncle or your grandmother. Why are you putting up with it with the most powerful person in the world? What do you think?
Yeah, I actually think that, and this is something that where I really do believe that the political consultants have been a blight, because they're always saying, "Oh, never mind that. Let's talk about kitchen table issues." Which, fine, let's talk about kitchen table issues. But I do think that there's a real visceral sense that corruption, abuse of power is bad, and that people really hate it. Another random different thing, but I had a conversation a few months ago with my old friend Kim Lane Shepley, who's a expert on Hungary, and during the biggest issue in the overthrow of the Orban regime was in fact corruption. That the symbol of the resistance movement, the property next to Orban's country estate, owned by relatives, but anyway, it apparently had zebras on it as a kind of lab, and so zebras became the symbol of the resistance. It was above all about the corruption of Fidesz and let's reclaim the country from these crooks. And I think that the potential power of that to reclaim America is huge. That if we do get through this, it will be because there's a mass reaction against this, people treating the government as their private piggy bank, their private tool.
I hope so. And I know we're running short of time, but on that, and I have to ask you a question that has really been bothering me a lot. And that is, I am watching this administration just pour through money. I mean, taxpayer money, lots of it. And of course, cut taxes on the wealthy and corporations. And I am extraordinarily concerned about what it looks like on the other side of that, in terms of if we get to the other side of the Trump administration and the reckoning comes due financially, aside from anything else, like in any previous period in American history before 1981, Congress ages ago would have raised taxes. That's just what they went to. That was always what they went to. And I look at this now and I think, we seem anyway to have people in power who say under no circumstances will we raise taxes. So I look at that and I think, what is the reckoning going to look like?
Yeah, and the answer is I don't know. The United States has had enormous running room. Our history of always paying our debts, 200 plus years of financial stability. To a certain extent, though that's exaggerated, the role of the dollar as the global currency and all of that has meant that the United States can put off a reckoning for a long time. But at some point, you have to say, how far does that go? If the idea is that America is a reliable, sensible country that will in the end always do the right thing, is that the way you would think about America now? A country that elected Donald Trump twice and all of that. And how it plays out, there comes a point at which the people are not willing to lend money to the United States, or only at a premium. That they're something has to happen, but how does that work? I mean, if for even a medium-sized country, you call in the International Monetary Fund, and which is in large part of something to hide behind. You're going to do unpopular things. You're going to have to raise taxes. You say, well, we had to do it. The IMF told us to do it. But the IMF is, America's too, we talk about too big to fail. America is too big to save. And it's hard to know. We can't probably even pretend to be invoking an external authority to do what's necessary. So, I mean, we did raise taxes. The New Deal raised taxes a lot, probably too much, given the Great Depression. The last time we had serious, no, that's not true. Clinton raised taxes, but only at the top end. George H.W. Bush had raised taxes significantly on a wider basis. So we've done it, but it has been decades since we've been able to do anything serious. And of course, if you ask about, well, why don't we cut spending instead? And then the question is, well, the U.S. government, what do we spend money on? And it's basically Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. How much are we going to? Yeah. So hard to imagine what does the political constant. I mean, it's not hard, right? The United States is still an enormous economy. And we're one of the lowest tax economies in the advanced world. So the money is there. How does it work out politically? I have no idea.
Well, that's where my sticking point is too, because again, if you even got rid of the George W. Bush tax cuts and the Donald Trump tax cuts, you don't have to go all the way back to Reagan even. You make a huge dent in our problems. But I'm just watching, what's really jumping out to me is I'm just watching the administration, pouring money into one thing or another that Congress has had no say in, as if it's all coming out of a gumball machine somewhere. And this, I look at the other side of that and I think, if you look at the people, for example, who supported the Ultimate Fighting Championship arena on the White House lawn on Sunday, those are all corporations, or most of them are corporations that paid no taxes last year. And I can't see them going, oh, you're right, I'm really concerned about the fact that some state is in bankruptcy, therefore I'm suddenly going to start paying money. And that I don't see what that looks like, unless, Massachusetts, for example, has this new millionaires tax that has gone incredibly well for the state. I don't know where the answer is at the national level.
Well, yeah, it's I mean, at some level, we really do need, hopefully not literally, but we kind of need the mobs with torches and pitchforks, where people start, where even the oligarchs say, oh, we have to change, because we have to restore some peace. Actually, one of the things that I think, the reason that we were able to be as responsible as we were for a number of decades was actually, I believe, the Soviet Union. A lot of things were done in the United States, even accepted by the super rich, because, well, there was this threat. And I don't know, maybe can we invent? I mean, I don't really want to go to war with China, so maybe it's time to open up Area 51 and explain that we need to do all of this to deal with the threat from aliens. I don't know.
Well, on that cheery note, we should probably pack it in. We've gone over, and I know people want to keep this short, but I could talk to you forever, because that opens up all kinds of new ways to think about the economy and for me, the politics of it.
I would, I'm always nervous when I do history, so thank you. And let's do this again.
So it's so much fun. I mean, again, I could just do the stories that we both know, that about old banking and stuff, because we come at it so differently. Maybe next time we can do something about the stock market and how there were literally fist fights in the financial markets during the Civil War.
Okay.
All right. Well, have a good, I guess it's a month, and we'll talk soon. And everybody, thank you for being here.